Hi, everyone, and welcome to the first session of a multi-part series that we'll be hosting focused on career development for security practitioners. This is an area that my co-host Karina and I have heard from so many practitioners about the need to address. And so to kick off, I'm Dave Zillman with Norwest. We are a multi-stage venture capital and growth equity firm focused on cybersecurity among a number of other verticals.
Thanks, Dave. Karina Aman, I'm with Korn Ferry. We're an executive search firm and a global talent advisory organization. And I focus on recruiting CISOs and cybersecurity professionals for my clients. They range everywhere from startup and PE firms all the way up to Fortune 50.
Great. And so Karina and I are just so thankful to our wonderful security practitioners who have graciously offered to spend their time with us today to provide insight and their own insight into their experiences. Just before we get started, though, a few areas that we just wanted to touch on from an administrative standpoint. First, everyone will see a Q&A button on the bottom of their screen. Please feel free to ask questions. Only Karina and I will see those questions. We will not disclose the people that are asking those questions. So this is a safe space. All questions are confidential. We received many questions during the registration form, and we will not be disclosing the names of the people asking those questions. Similar to the point of having so many questions raised, we had to narrow the focus for this initial session. And so in this discussion, we will be specifically focused on education, training and development, and moving into a leadership position from an individual contributor role. In subsequent sessions, we will cover a multitude of topics, such as opportunities for expanding into adjacent roles within cybersecurity, how to actually search for a new opportunity while employed, how to negotiate compensation and benefits, how to become a board member, and many other topics to cover. So we hope that you'll be able to join us for subsequent sessions as well. And we will publish the dates for those shortly after the conclusion of this session. So let's get started with our wonderful panelist. So I have the honor of introducing Rinki Sethi. She is the CISO of Bill, formerly Bill.com, that may be familiar. Previously CISO of Twitter, and has worked at a number of hallmark companies such as Rubrik, IBM, Palo Alto Networks, Intuit, and has also been an advisor and board members to a number of companies such as ForgeRock and Board, and we're really thankful to have Rinki. Also like to introduce Carl Mattson. Carl is currently the field CISO of No Name Security, which many have probably seen, was just acquired by Akamai. The deal is pending closing. So pending congratulations, Carl, to you. Carl was previously CISO of PennyMac and CISO of City National Bank, and has worked at PNC, Target, and a number of other great companies, and started his career as a U.S. Army officer as a non-commissioned U.S. Army officer. So thank you for your services, Carl. And then I'll hand it over to Karina.
Yes, well, and I have the pleasure of introducing two CISOs who have worked with very iconic brands. The first one is Andy Kasperson. For the last 5 years, he's been the CISO of Gap Inc., a brand that we all know and maybe even have in our closets. He is a longtime practitioner. Through he's worked with clients through PwC and EY. He's also, built his career through protecting Charles Schwab. And Andy is also an advisor. He sits on the board of the Retail and Hospitality ISAC, kind of lending his expertise, but also, gathering up the most recent information about the threat landscape and how to share and disseminate that, with folks in the industry. Also joining us is Jason Willows, who is with Verily, which is a Google company, and was also the head of Android and Play ecosystem security at Google. He's also been a CISO for enterprise software companies such as Cornerstone On Demand. And Jason, you are now serving on the Information Security Leadership Foundation, and you're also an investor as well, through SVCI. So really pleased to have all of you with us today. And with that in mind, let's go ahead and just kick it right off. And I'm just going to direct my first question to Andy and to Jason. to you both. And looking at your backgrounds, you both have technical degrees. You both started out with either in computer science, or you've gotten graduate degrees in this space. But when you look back, what were the most impactful education milestones for you? Whether it's graduate, undergraduate, whether it's self-taught and continuous education, what's made the most impact on your career? Andy, you want to get started?
Sure, absolutely, Karina. Thanks, and thanks for the nice introduction. I would say it was funny where it's start talking about education, and that's so impossibly long ago that it's kind of difficult to kind of think about that. How much things have changed, and particularly to end up as a security practitioner when that really didn't exist in the mid '90s when I was graduating from university. So it was. And I think probably the most impactful thing was that I was very interested in kind of the burgeoning growth of the internet and everything else. And at that point, the collegiate field of study was steering us all to do COBOL writing. And so when I did a final project my senior year about starting an internet service provider that would do web hosting, and I was told by the professor that what I was proposing was a great idea, except for it was illegal to make money on the internet. My point being that that's what I think of when I think of a milestone of like, oh, I'm going to have to go and kind of figure out what's new, that it's the kind of that I wasn't going to get out of a book where things were going. And so that was what kind of sent me down the path of kind of getting into, the world of the kind of internet security and looking into, kind of like I've cut my teeth as a, router admin and a Unix administrator and things like that. So those were and that was, I think as you kind of look at, much in the same way today, there's a lot of, there's a lot of interest in AI, but there's not a lot of, I think you're going to have to learn by doing there. So I'm sorry, I'll cut it off there and let Jason chat.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, so I have sort of a non-traditional path. Actually, my undergraduate was in a non-technical field, and I decided my senior year I wanted to build a Linux server. I remember that. So, and I was hanging out with these folks who were just reading a lot of magazines like 2600, and we're talking about hacking Linux and all of that. And that really whet my appetite and caused me to pursue grad school. So a lot of self-taught in the beginning. I did a graduate program, which still exists today, called the Scholarship for Service. It's provided by, I believe at the time was the National Science Foundation and the Department of Defense combination. So I leveraged that opportunity. Great experience, great mentors, really hands-on, having to build and write our own secure OS so we can get real exposure to it. Kind of like what Andy's saying, you kind of have to do it to understand it and to live it. I think the other big seminal thing I did there was I started our first Capture the Flag competition, which if anybody's not familiar, it's a popular thing in a lot of conferences, certainly DEF CON, the biggest one, in Vegas, where you create the game you have in normal life, physical world, put it into a computer, try to grab a token that's encrypted, and then and one team's trying to defend it, one team's trying to attack it. I think that really taught me a lot. And then in the similar sort of in the training courses, I had a rare opportunity to take a class with George Kurtz when he was still at Foundstone. So we're really talking a long time ago. He, when they were still writing those early books that they did, great trainer, great crew of people, really whet my appetite to want to be a practitioner and learn more. So I think it was not one thing in particular, but just being exposed to so many different dimensions that gave me the bug and helped me get good foundation.
Jason, that's great insight and perspective in some of the capture the flag exercises that you were a part of. And I guess I wonder, Rinky, in your experience, having worked at, from the, Palo Alto Networks, the IBMs and Intuits of the world, I'm curious about the on-the-job training and development and the mentorship, the apprenticeship aspects that really benefited you the most. And then as you look back on your career, as you highlight those that were the most impactful, what would those be?
Yeah, I would say there's a few things. So I go back to eBay. I just had, I worked for one of the first CISOs in the retail space, and he just was such a great mentor and sponsor. I remember I was 5 years into my career when I went to eBay, and ended up accidentally falling into a manager role, and just, you know, he just kind of saw potential and took me under his wings, and I think not just mentored me, but like also said, no, you're not ready for a promotion and you need to go and get trained up on the following things. And then when I did, actually, you know, had the power and was a sponsor to promote me. And so I think what it's been from what I've seen is I've had folks that have been my peers that have taught me, like, literally, how do you do a pen test? What does a server room look like? And have just kind of taken me under their wings. And I've seen mentorship in either, sometimes it's your peers, sometimes it's folks that are like your boss, sometimes it's other executives in the company, or even sometimes the mentorship comes from your own direct team. But it's the moments for me that have had the most growth, have been either where folks have actually taught me skills, that went back to very early career, when I was at Walmart and PG&E, and then came in different forms later. But I would say when people give you really critical feedback because they care, even though it kind of hurts in the moment, I think those have been the moments that I've seen the most growth personally. But I've had technical mentors very early career, and then later those came in different forms. Later in my career too, I think when I took on board positions, I needed different kind of mentors that had kind of been there, done that on that front as well. So mentors have changed drastically, but the few that come to mind that were really meaningful were when I was at Walmart. I had a peer who technically taught me all about cybersecurity, and helped me find my passion area in cyber. And then later, you know, and then earlier on, a little bit later on, it was at eBay. It was my boss.
Carl, I wonder, in your experience, did you go out and seek mentors? How did you identify them? How did you engage them? How do you encourage them to spend time with you?
So I actually haven't. But part of that is because I have, because I was in the military for about 10 years. And then when I moved into the corporate sector, I was also accustomed to having my role change very frequently. In the military, every 6 to 12 months, you're going to change your job. And so eventually I started at Target, and that was a very common thing at Target. If you've been in a role 18 months at Target, you've been there too long. That is not a good sign. Like, if you're performing well, you're probably having managers and leaders give you guidance to move to a next role, to expand your skills and to develop. And so for me, I think that having moved to new roles, and that on the job first 9 months, 12 months, and then at 18 months, that's like I've gotten most of the learning out of the way, move on to something new. And so for me, I think that I haven't really had, I would call it dedicated mentorships, but I've had people who taught me a craft for a short period of time to get me up to speed on something. And then my pattern has been to keep moving and keep changing. And that has been, I think, a huge benefit to me is to never get stale, never get stagnant in a role, and just keep moving to something new.
Just had a question come in, which I'll paraphrase quickly, but the question is whether folks should go out and spend their own money to get additional degrees, learn different categories. Should they go out, whether they came from kind of the .com era or not? How should they invest in their own education if it relates to spending tens of thousands of dollars that may require taking on some debt?
I can chime in here and kick off. I actually went through that. I did my master's degree when I was at PG&E, and the motivation was I was a college new grad. I went to PG&E, and folks were so experienced. And a few years in, when I realized, like, if I want to go and get another job, I just can't even compete with folks that already have their CISSP and all these other things. So I started studying for the CISSP. I went and actually got my master's degree, and my motivation was one thing, that I want to get a job that pays me more. So it was money. And I felt like, to differentiate myself at that point, because I couldn't qualify for most certifications because of lack of experience, that the master's degree would help differentiate me. And it actually did work. So I think, and it was expensive. It was an online master's degree in cybersecurity. So I think you have to kind of decide, like, why are you taking it? Sometimes some folks are going to say that want to learn. And I think if you've really got to decide what the motivation there is. It is quite an expense. And so but I also believe that I've spent a lot of money out of my pocket to train myself, even while I was working, because I think it's investment back in yourself and your own growth, and you have to own that. But how much you decide to spend and what path you want to take, I think there's lots of different paths now. Back then there weren't. So that was 20 years ago. So I think there's a lot of different paths, and you kind of got to decide that. For me, it was absolutely worth it.
There's Andy, Carl, Jason.
Yeah, no, I mean, I just, again, not having had to kind of walk, my path is very different. And I think and I'm thinking about in the context of as when hiring for, even kind of senior deputy CISO type roles and everything else, I would say, and this might be Karina, you can keep me honest here, but spend a lot more time at the top of the resume than the bottom. That it's almost kind of like when I think about, my career where I did a long stint at Charles Schwab and then went back into consulting. And that time in consulting was almost, it's a little bit of, and kind of having that in my background, it's like more often than not, I find that being a way that's, it's like when you're looking at a new role or something like that, the spec will often be, we need somebody who's, or where the profile involves a consulting background or things like that. So there's certainly been an explosion in these kind of master degree programs around cybersecurity and everything else. But it's like, are those and they could probably get you in the door on a number of specs and searches and things like that. But it's also just kind of looking at, like, there are other ways to kind of round out. And then Rinky, to your point about the CISSP, I think that's like, it's not, it's again, and people who know me would laugh at me talking about, I've changed my thinking on it, where it's just kind of I always tend to kind of ignore a job that says, oh, a CISSP is very necessary. But I think the climate we're in right now, it's like, it's a good protection for yourself to say, I'm bona fide, but it's not if you're in an environment where somebody's going like, oh, well, we need a master's degree, we need a CISSP, those are kind of at least red flags for me in terms of what what does the job actually entail. So just counterpoint there. And just to kind of close on that, it's like, I kind of see consulting as a great way to get paid to kind of like round out your written communication skills, a little bit of client facing time, and kind of get you out of the SOC to kind of interact with real people. That's been very valuable over my career.
Well, so speaking of those communication skills, right? And I'll share my perspective, as an executive recruiter, is that a lot of times, what my clients are looking for is the ability not just to, be a subject matter expert, but you have to be able to influence, because sometimes you don't have the authority, right? You don't have but you've got a lot of accountability, so you've got to influence. So my question to I'm going to, send this over to Carl, is, what kind of, how have you developed your communication skills? Like, in terms of either writing or, the verbal, or even like, really honing in on how to influence.
Well, I would say that I don't know that there's a technique other than quantity. Honestly, I think that you might, if you follow me on LinkedIn or if we're connected, you probably noticed that I do a lot of podcasts and I do a lot of dinners and I do a lot of this and a lot of that. And I don't know that there's any trick to it other than just getting comfortable in my own skin. So for example, if Dave asked me to join a panel discussion on career development, I'm happy to say yes. And I don't get nervous anymore because I probably have done 20 of them and 30 of them and 40 of them over the course of the years. And so I think that the first piece of advice is to say yes to anything. And so a person who goes out of their way to like find a way, maybe like in their local OWASP chapter or their local ISACA chapter or InfraGard chapter, where they need to have a specialist talk about something specific. Maybe you are early career, mid-career, but in your community, there are people who want to know what you have to say. And so I'd say seeking out those opportunities and getting track record and getting some volume under your belt, and then asking people along the way for feedback. Then you get to learn, like, okay, did I miss the mark on something? Were my slides okay, etc. But until you start, you kind of can't progress. And so that's the first thing I'd say is start with a thought that you have to get reps to start getting quality in terms of how you quality communicate.
Yeah. No, that's great. It's I have another question just came in, right? And it seems like this is going to be it's going to be personal to some of you. Is that it seems like the CISO role is hired by people with little security experience, but a lot of business acumen. And so the question to you is, what's been successful in your opinion or your experience in communicating how you can actually be effective as a CISO versus checking the box or versus sprinkling in a lot of buzzwords. And so this is, and earlier before some of the participants, before you came on, we were talking about Change Healthcare, and some of the Senate testimony about how that happened. But, Jason, do you want to, address this? It's like, yeah, working with hiring managers, or being hired by hiring managers, right, who aren't security practitioners, but, they've got big business responsibilities.
And sort of how you get past that next step. I think that I think what's really important is, you kind of have to step outside yourself and think, what am I trying to communicate, right? So maybe beyond the terminology that you've maybe grown up with and you feel like is pretty standard fare for you, I think you have to, expect that when you're in that type of career, you're going to be communicating with a lot of people, not only the hiring manager, but perhaps a board at some point, or perhaps other senior leaders who largely are not going to have a lot of cyber background. They might have some compliance background. They might have a lot of engineering background, and you kind of have to be a little bit of a chameleon in some ways and sort of pivot to who you're speaking with and kind of speak their language. I find kind of connect with them so that they understand where you're coming from, which is, oftentimes going to be taking real world situations like the one we just talked about, Change Health, and trying to connect it to what they encounter on a daily basis. I think that's oftentimes what I do, is to try to bring it down to earth and make sure that, they can appreciate what I've accomplished in comparison to some other similar thing, whether, it was change management for a huge policy you deployed. That doesn't have to be about security, or, you deployed a new product feature, right? Or you fixed a bug, right? It could be a security bug, it could be a regular bug. So, I think you try to acclimate to what people understand. And that I find, even once you are a CISO, is important, because there's a lot of marketing involved, right? So you're not always felt like this other team and this team that folks have to go to sort of get some feedback, but really they should be folks that you're commonly, working with all the time, day to day, and you're going to want to be socializing and teaching them as well, right? So otherwise they're not going to be first to come to you, right? Because they feel like they're going to have to use a dictionary to understand what you're trying to accomplish.
Ranky, I'm curious, in your experience, having worked across a multitude of companies, whether it be Bill or Twitter or some of the others, how have you been able to bridge that gap in, communicating to the business folks, communicating to the board that probably has very limited security expertise, versus your subordinates that are deeply technical, deeply experienced, and be able to oscillate between the two?
Yeah, I feel the CISO role has evolved just tremendously over the last 10 years, and more so over the last 5 years, I would say. There's been just an evolution of the position, and it's a business leader role. And if you don't run it that way, I think you'll fail. And so, and as we've seen in the news and everywhere, I think the level of communication, the level of influence, the communication with the board, all of that, I think you've got to, it's a real business leader role. So although you're, I think going back to even the question, and if I can chime in on that too, on the prior question, which is, I think it's really important that you're able to bring it up to a business level. The interesting thing is that you in the security team, it's going to be highly technical folks. It's going to be actually a mix, right, of highly technical folks and folks that can communicate, that are doing your awareness and culture and all those things. So you have a range. And I think how I see it is, and I came from the security engineering background. That was 2 decades ago. And I have folks on the team that are highly technical, and the questions I'm asking, whether we have an incident or anything, is okay, help me relate this back to the business so I can now communicate this to the executive team or the board. And it's a lot about understanding regulations and kind of the requirements and what you need to do, what you need to communicate. And so it has become an extremely challenging role. I think one thing that's interesting is there's not a lot of standardization either, right? Like there is for CFOs on what they report, or in terms of how they're audited. And so I think hopefully that will change as well. But I think it is a business leader role. I feel like my main job is education. And so it's making sure that I can communicate risk effectively to other business leaders, to the board. And then again, bringing that back to the team as well. And I think when I think back to the team and the technical leaders on the team, coaching them on how do you communicate more effectively is really important as they grow their careers too in cyber.
Yeah, that makes sense. Andy, I'm curious, from your experience, having worked at Gap as an example, your ability to, talk to the senior executives and talk about business and compliance risk and quantifying some of those, more technical things. How have you been successful in communicating that?
Yeah, and I'm thinking about this also just through the lens of, and again, I'm just thinking about folks who, reported directly to me and had aspirations about like, okay, how do I get that thing and everything else? And how do I get that, experience? And I think the original question, which has, I think, moved on now, but it was along the lines of, how do I, it's when we're thinking about hiring and everything else, it's like, I do think we in security like to flock around other security people and kind of talk to them about like, oh yeah, no, and have you seen, the great tools at No Name? They're so much better on their API gateways or whatever. It's the to kind of break out of, especially in the context of a large company like a Gap or Schwab or something like that, of like, who are the players in the CIO space, and that it's like, that ultimately, does your leader give you space to kind of interact with those folks, or are you the all-star on a team that no one gets to see play? And it's so in getting those kind of, that was when I came into Schwab, it was like very quickly, and I think it was partly because I had when I was hired there, a leader who was focused elsewhere allowed me to be very kind of like roaming free and everything else, and I built relationships that kind of served me well down the road. And so I think that's like anyone who's kind of like knocking at that and like, okay, how do I get, you can go and get, Decker Communication, you can go and do all the, go to Toastmasters, whatever it is, and kind of like work on those sorts of things. But it's the, do you have enough kind of interactions with somebody who is going to leave the company and be a CIO somewhere else, and they know what you can do, or are you, only kind of playing to an audience of one?
Carl, curious your experience in this topic.
Actually, I want to quote Steve Zalewski, because I think the former CISO from Levi Strauss, he always has this phrase that he uses when he talks to security companies about, explain to me how you help me sell jeans faster. And as a security professional, that's a really hard question to answer, right? So like if CrowdStrike or Zscaler, whoever, like pretend a company, if you're going to pitch that company, you have to align what your value proposition is with like the mission of the business. And so I think that idea, it kind of dovetails with one of the questions coming in on like top line revenue generating versus risk and compliance, bottom line communication messaging, is that there has to be connective tissue to the of the risk messaging and compliance messaging to the fundamental mission of the organization. And so every time I sit down with a new vendor, I have Steve Zalewski's voice running through my head, I ask the question, how does this help me sell jeans faster? And if I need to answer that question, because it's exactly the right question for security people, is to be thinking about how to hone their language and their decisions specifically in that kind of like really business focused context.
To tying this together, I'm curious, there was a question that came in. What are the essential skills for a CISO today? So there are lots of folks on this call that are director level, VP level, that are aspiring to be CISOs. And so if there were the top 3 responsibilities for a CISO in the context of how the role has evolved, as everyone has explained, I'm curious how maybe each of you would describe those top 3. Maybe Rick, you're nodding your head. It sounds like you've got some ideas.
Yeah, I think one, have to be able to communicate effectively, which I talked about earlier, and be able to influence at all levels. One piece of advice I would give, and I've started doing this with my own team, is that ask your CISO or your leader if you can attend board meetings. Like you can be a fly on the wall so you can see how that goes. One, I think it's great to just know what skills you might need to build in a room like that, and especially where you get questions that you may not anticipate and how you deal with that and navigate that. I think it's a really important skill. And so I would really suggest just ask. You know, it may or may not be possible to attend, but it doesn't hurt to ask. And I think folks are, at least what I've seen is folks are receptive to it, and it helps with growth. I think the second is the ability to attract and retain talent. It's a really, like, you have to have a network, you have to be able to recruit and retain talent, and you know, be able to sell folks to come and work for you and work for the company that you're at. And I would say three, I mentioned the network piece, but a lot of times we give up networking because it takes a lot of time. And I can say, like, one of the most valuable things, either in hearing very early on about a breach or getting more details about something, has been the network. I get information from the CISO network before I do anywhere else. And so I think the networking aspect is so important, not just for that, but I think just to be able to be plugged into industry and be able to call folks when you need help. And it's incredible how helpful people can be. And so I think those are kind of the top three that just came to mind for me. I think effective communications, be able to recruit and retain talent, and then your network.
No, thank you, Ranky. I mean, it's so that kind of, like, touches on, in terms of, like, making that transition, right? Like, as Dave said, there's a lot of people here who are directors and VP levels, kind of aspiring to that. It's like, so in terms of, like, how you kind of, like, broke through, right? Kind of reach escape velocity, if you will, to, kind of set yourself on the path. What were those, like, management skills? Like, how did you learn them? And by management skills, it's like, it's managing people, it's change management, it's strategic thinking. It's, I mean, there's a whole toolbox of these, but I'm just curious. It's I mean, how, Jason, let's start with you, because, you've been a sitting CISO, for at a couple of companies now. But when you think back on your career, like, what were those essential management skills that you had to acquire, and how did you do it?
So, I mean, I think there's something to be said for what Ricky said. Those are all really critical things that I would also hype up too. And I think they were really important also, just for things like feedback, people that I could ask questions to and figure out, kind of ask those questions, like, how do I maneuver myself? So I think that's pretty important. I think that one of the big things is, how do you connect to the business and their objectives? The statement before from Steve about, how do I sell more jeans? I use that all the time. I literally just came out of a meeting with a huge group of product managers, and I'm trying to make them connect to me and understand, like, why security and privacy is an enabler for them, why it matters, so that they can, raise up the fact that, they want security involved in all of what they're doing, and they want to do feature development and stuff that has, like, a trust kind of bent to it. So I think part of it is also just sort of growing the base of people that are know your name, understand that you are, somebody who is the primary contact for that in your organization. Work on big things, think big. If you have a leader above you who's giving you that allowance to, to solve big problems, I think that's something that's probably helped me the most. I mean, that was sort of a Google philosophy, how do you solve big problems, and scale? And that was a large part of, how I moved around. I think being balanced and not getting over rotated on, on too many specific things, and not trying to explain to everybody everything you're doing, but staying on message. What are the top 3 things that I've accomplished or that I'm working on? How do I stay the course? If it's too early to have a roadmap that shows that, then at least be a person that people know is focused and gets those things done. So, I mean, these are independent of, I think, the security discipline itself, but just being a good leader. Be kind to people, because people are going to talk about you. So, like Ricky said, you want to make sure that you can recruit people. And to do that, people have to say good things about you, right? You want to be someone that they speak nicely about in the industry. Oh, I liked working for that person, right? They're kind, they're thoughtful, they think about my career, invest in them, because you never know when those people are going to come back through your life. I think that's a pretty important way to build community. And then, find ways to not only solve problems as an individual contributor, but through others. So there's concepts that people have used for years, like building champion communities, if you will, within your, within the colleagues that you work with. And people that can be indirect influencers on your behalf, right? So you can be a force multiplier, to take a military term, put it here, expand your surface. I think a lot of that will help to bring visibility, give more opportunity to work with more people, and have just more exposure than you would have as an individual contributor, because the director is really driving people collectively in a single, marshaling them in a certain direction. And that's not going to come from, individual features you deploy necessarily, or an incident that you managed, one off.
No, for sure. It's well, we have one very interesting question, and I want to follow up because, Jason, you said something, be nice to people, right? I mean, that's just something we all learn in kindergarten, hopefully. But this is a really interesting question, which is, in terms of managing people, right? How do you all feel about expressing vulnerability, in terms of team communications, right? And it does come up a lot, right, in terms of team engagement, and building trust. And so, and this person said, this is one of the more difficult, quote unquote, soft skills to master. I'm curious how you feel about that, right? Because there's this conflict between, on the one hand, it's a very public, high pressure role, and yet on the other hand, being able to demonstrate and show vulnerability can go a really long way.
If I could take a swing at this one, it's a great topic, but I also think that we might be overthinking it a little bit here, which is a healthy leadership relationship with your managers or individual contributors is where you're being honest with each other. Like, there's integrity in that relationship. So, for example, if your vulnerability we're talking about is like, our program's not very good here, we need to get better, or the vulnerability might be like, I'm feeling stressed at home, I could really use someone to help pick up the slack, right? Those are ingredients of like a healthy relationship, honestly. And that's, so in terms of like expression of vulnerability, I think it's essential, that yes, because underlying that is does your relationship with the members of your team, does it have integrity? And integrity is healthy, and integrity includes vulnerability. So I think it has to be there. If you could internalize that as am I hiding a vulnerability, then that means that you don't have a very healthy relationship with the members of your team. So that's what I would suggest.
Yeah, I'll chime in as well, to offer a perspective. I feel that folks really want to feel like they can bring their authentic self to work, and that they're in a safe space that where if they make kind of if they take informed risks and there's a mistake made, that they're going to be forgiven for it, right? That it's okay to fail sometimes. And so that's where I think, if you as a leader are showing that, oh, I'm perfect, everything's perfect, right? Then, and folks can't see that, hey, that I can, can I bring my own self to work, or do I need to be a certain way? And I've been in teams where leaders don't show vulnerability. It doesn't feel like you can be yourself there. So you kind of try to be this person you think you need to be successful there. And I think folks, that's not an environment that you'll thrive in, right? And eventually you'll want to leave to go to a place where you can be who you want to be. So I think as a leader, whether it's sharing your vulnerability or just being conscious of how do I create an environment where people can bring themselves and they know it's okay to make mistakes, and as long as we're learning from them. And I think that's the more important part. And that can just be like, hey, talking about a mistake maybe you made earlier in your career and like what that led to and like how you learned from it. Or it could be something where you're reflecting on even the work, as Carl mentioned, like just talking about a program that didn't go well and being open about it. So I think they can come in a lot of different forms.
So I'd love to double click on that, Rinky, because that was a question that came in, and it's just around failure. And the position of a security practitioner is a challenging one because you're constantly in the line of fire, and every so often, fire gets through. Some of it may or may not be your fault as a security practitioner. Would love to hear how you all have managed with failure, right? Maybe a breach, maybe some adverse activity in your organizations, and the buck perhaps stops with the security leader. It may or may not be your fault, but how do you deal with it? Some of these are quite public, right? It seems that almost every other day or so, there's something in the press. The media loves to pick on security breaches. How do you all deal with that? Maybe Andy,
Yeah.
Over to you. You have any
Well,
suggestions?
and I would start by kind of like it's like so, and it kind of ties into a little bit of the vulnerability piece where it's like I think um you know I would define the places where I've kind of in my consulting career and everything else, when the security program has failed is when there's a full breakage or disconnect between kind of where the company strategy or the IT strategy is going and the security team is there. You walk into an office and it's like, this is a oil and gas company, but you don't see that the security team understands that, the point of the exercise is not to deliver a compliance program, or a vulnerability report or something like that, that it's we're here to, extract minerals from the ground or whatever it is, right? So it's the trying to dress it up, but the point being is that oftentimes those failures come from, it is not from a technical issue, but it's like leaders and personalities and communication breakdown and everything else. And so it's like, I just think about those times when those, kind of because it is an inherently political exercise, and as those things start to swirl, it also bleeds over onto the team. And unfortunately, you kind of like in the current environment, and especially post-pandemic and everything else, I think it just puts a lot of stress on, even when we were all in the office, the security team is often sequestered to a different floor or doesn't feel connected to the rest of the organization. And you can really have if you're not as a leader kind of recognizing where somebody's holding on a little bit too tight or is getting a little bit too angry on that, it's like, it's going to drive negative business outcomes, but it can also be some really unfortunate, personal outcomes for folks. And so it's like, that's and I think when cultures have kind of driven that, where either people burn out or worse, that's, those are the things you need. Once you go through that, and again, it's like and seeing that happen to somebody, it's like, it's a painful thing, and you have to carry that with you. And so it's like, you learn as a leader, like, that's, I think frankly, didn't get a lot of that coming up in the early aughts about like, hey, you need to kind of be checking in on your folks and everything else. You got to have, butts and seats by 8 a.m., that kind of a thing. It's like that pivot has been ongoing the last 20 years. So anyway, just thinking there.
Again, I'm curious, your departure from Twitter was quite public. It was in the press and the media. How did that affect you? How did you manage that?
Yeah, it was actually a tough time, but it's funny you mentioned like breaches, and it's rarely the CISO's fault, the breach. That's not what I consider failure or a mistake. And even my departure from Twitter, like, I'm actually very, proud of like the work that I did at Twitter, and don't even consider that a failure or any of that, even the situation that followed and all of that. In fact, it's one of my proud moments. And so what I would say is that breaches don't equal failure. I think and then, we've seen some very public cases of things are CISOs and like what's happened after a breach. And I think that's failure of the system, not of the individuals. Mistakes and failures is literally how I've learned. And there's been a lot of them, Dave. And so like, very early in career, I brought production down. I've gotten in trouble for running a phishing test without communicating well. And so like, I've done everything. And then you realize, oh no, like you have to communicate that you're doing some of this stuff before you do it. So but that's how you learn. It's when you do the same mistake again and again and again and don't learn from it that it becomes a problem. But a lot of us, even in these very public breaches, we're like paving the path and navigating, like creating the rules as we go here. And a lot of these things that we're seeing right now. And so those are not what I see as failure. I think the CISO role has become, like I said, the evolution has been interesting. It's going to be interesting to see the evolution over the next few years. But that's, I think failures and mistakes are how we grow and learn. And I think if you're going to be an innovative security practitioner, you're going to be trying new products, new tools, building new things, and you have to fail and you have to make mistakes in that. Otherwise, you're never going to take the risk of doing something new. So I think it's really important that you do recognize that, learn from it, and be proud of those things, because I think the mistakes and failures are what guided my success as well. So, but yeah, I think that public kind of, I think it was Andy that said it when we were talking about this. But a lot of the CISOs that have been very public, they're actually doing really well now. So wherever they've had very public breaches, and they're doing really well now. So anyway, I do think there's a lot to learn from our mistakes, and but that's not one that I consider that. The Twitter, it was not something that I considered a failure or a mistake.
Love it. I think that's such powerful words, Rinky. Love the perspective and the context. Just checking time here, and we have a barrage of questions. I wanted to touch on one other quick topic, based on the questions that have come in, and it's around building community and networks of like-minded security practitioners. Are there any suggestions from the panelists about different communities that you have found to be the most, active and insightful, prolific? Are there certain categories? Are there certain conferences, events, others that you would recommend for the participants to get involved with? Carl, any suggestions on your end?
Yes. Although I would say I hope it's not arrogant for me to say this. I'm a well-connected CISO, and I know like 1% of the CISOs. And so there are so many networks, and I can give a list of like 8, but the truth is like Chicago and Dallas and New York and San Francisco all have their own networks. And so it is impossible for me to give like 5 networks without, and each of us could give our top 5 and they would have 0 overlap. So I think the important thing is to have a regional, like start regionally, start locally, because in Minneapolis, we have a Twin Cities network, and that is not the same as the networks that I plug into in New York and San Francisco. So I think start regionally, and certainly anybody can connect with me, and I can do my best to give you 3 or 4 suggestions in each region. But that's what I would say is start regionally and then think globally, because some of those global networks like the, I don't know, CISO 50 or some things like that, they're hard to get into and they're expensive, and now not everyone's ready for that. So I'd start
smaller and local.
Start small, start local, and start with like the nonprofits. Start with OWASP, start with ISACA, start with InfraGard. They're free, they're easy, and they're right down the street. So
not the person on your LinkedIn DMs offering you an Amazon gift card.
Hey, that might be me. That hits close to home.
I was going to add, like, I loved what Jason said earlier around being kind. I feel that like you work with the people that work for you, you work with your, peers, you've worked at several companies, and those people all end up becoming your network. Like every relationship is your network. And so and then as you move from company to company, and then those folks, their folks, like the folks they're connected to, become part of your extended network. And it's crazy, like you might have a relationship with somebody today, and 10 years later, somehow that becomes very valuable in some way or form. And so I think networks can mean a lot of things. I think for me, it's been a lot of those peer relationships. There's been Slack groups. It's been my former employees who are now CISOs that become part of my network, or, and to what Carl said too, there's like RSA used to be really small back in the day. And so like I used to, it was like everybody knew everybody type situation. Now it's massive, but it can be these small conferences. It can be your, network can be built in so many different ways. But I think the more meaningful ones have been where I've interacted with folks in some way and worked with them in some way, and that ends up becoming part of your extended network.
Karma and paying it forward.
And I think,
there.
and just one other point on that, Dave, and I know it was on some of the pre-questions, but I think one of the things that happens with some of these networks, especially kind of in the early days, was that it was, and again, I realized that, I am the bald bearded CISO. It's like it was like I meet people all the time, like, oh, we've met before. I'm like, no, you're thinking of somebody else. But it's like those networks do have a tendency to be, kind of like insular and self-replicating. And so it's like, if you do get into those, it's just kind of making sure that, cybersecurity is, got more ground to cover than most in terms of making sure that it's a kind of an inclusive and kind of space where people feel represented and safe. And so I think that's the other thing, is just making sure you're hanging out in groups where that's, at least something, again, back to paying it forward. Just a area I think we need to focus on.
Yeah, it's so Andy, you mentioned something about being inclusive, right? And so, Rinky, you're one of the few women, I mean, honestly, right, one of the few women who are CISOs. It's like there's not that many of them. And so I'm just curious. It's like, so one question that we did get from someone is that how, as a woman, they felt overlooked for this position, right? It's like, so Ringy, like what set you apart? What did you do? You talked about mentorship, right? You talked about people, but what advice would you give to someone who is, maybe traditionally overlooked for this role?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I would say like one of the things being one of the few women and have faced like a lot of adversity just being on teams where you're the only female there. And I feel like in the actual roles that I've been, like people aren't necessarily, it's not, there's sometimes folks tend to say that like, it's biased against women or whatever. I've noticed a lot that I've had to do a lot of education. Like they don't know, right? And so like even when I was the only woman on the team and I wanted, this is back in the day, so it sounds archaic now, but when I needed to work from home because I just had a baby and the commute, like I needed to work from home once a week, and my boss had said no, and I had to go back and say like explain, right, and educate on why this was important and why the company needed to have work from home policy and so forth back then, and so and drive that, and and then dads came back and said, oh, that was like that was really helpful that you drove that, because we didn't, it's a problem for fathers too that we don't get that flexibility. So I think a lot of it has had to be education along the way on those around that, like, and I've found that when you do tell folks and you explain what you need, folks are actually very open to it. In terms of being overlooked for the role, I think like really being confident around the skills that you're bringing to the table. And I think also raising your hand and saying that you're interested. And I don't know what situation this individual was in, but I think also saying, not assuming that people would sit and know that you're the one that wants that role. So it's saying that, hey, I am very interested in taking on that role, and then being open to feedback too. If it's either, like I said, I talked about a prior role that I was interested in and my boss was like, you're not ready for it yet, right? And gave me feedback and like very specific. So even asking like, hey, why was I not considered, I think is really important as well.
That's great. Well, I'm just being mindful of time. I wanted to ask one last question for everyone and just go around the table, which is, what's the best career advice that you have received? No shortage of advice out there. So maybe Carl, just because you're at the top left of my screen, we'll start with you and then we'll go across, just a couple of thoughts.
I think my best accidental career move has been to move across the country for roles that said yes to me, the way I was. So I think that a lot of us are thinking about our career and all the things we want to change about ourselves and all the things that we're not good at. Think about the things that you are good at, that there are companies out there who want to hire you, and think about making a move, like move across the country to that company that wants to say yes to who you are right now. So I think geographic moving can be a career accelerator.
Jason?
I'd say that be passionate about the company you're going to work for. If you're a mission-driven kind of person and you need to be behind that and believe in the product and love the product and want to use it and sell it, have your friends use it. I think that's pretty important. If you don't really believe in the mission of what you're doing, at some point you're gonna wake up on some Tuesday and say, I just don't want to go work today. I mean, it's security in many ways, barring the verticalization and regulatory stuff, there's a lot of similarities of the job, and you should love it for the people that you work with and for the product that you're supporting, right? That you're protecting, or that you're ensuring there's privacy is maintained, whatever it is. That I think that be passionate and like kind of, if you can, love the product that you're going to work for, because it'll maintain that passion for you on the hard days.
Yeah.
I would say be really curious and really choose the people that you're going to go work with and work for. I think that's the most important thing. I think a lot of times folks go after brands and big names, and I think it's all about the people at the end of the day. So choose the people you work with. And in this particular field, I think that's more meaningful to have that support.
Andy?
Yeah, and I would think that probably the best advice I got was about understand, it's like, so one, like Jason saying, being passionate about where you work, and some of that goes with understanding how money's made, right? It's kind of a little bit of a variation on the how many, the genes comment, but it's the getting into the financials and unpacking it. And, you know, for instance, early in my career at Schwab, went through the process of getting my Series 7, just because that's what we did. And that opened up you know, a lot more than I learned in any college finance class. And by the way, it also is currency for interacting with business folks and everything else. You're learning the lingo and everything else. And so it's like, that is such it just opened a lot of doors. Yeah. And then I think the other bit of advice is that people don't leave their jobs, they leave their managers. And you know, kind of remembering that is the, you know, that's the dynamic as you're managing people, is making sure that you're, you know, exhibiting behaviors that you'd want to experience yourself. And so anyway.
Yeah. No, thank you for that. That's, I mean, all great, you know, words of wisdom. And I don't know about you, Dave, but this hour went by really quickly.
I'm shocked. I just looked at the clock. I'm like, oh boy, we're at the top of the hour already.
Yeah, you know, but you know, to thank you to all of our panelists today, but also to those of you who are attending, who invested this hour of your time in yourself, you know, and to hear, you know, kind of like the people who are ahead of you, right? This is what awaits you. It's like, look, this being a CISO is a tough job. It's a lonely job. And yet you're needed more than ever. We need you, right? The world needs you. And so we hope that you will join us again, you know, as we continue to go out into, you know, we will expand this series, you know, to help you develop and also to help you thrive in your career, you know, as a cybersecurity leader. And we'd love to see you as a panelist here one day, you know, as part of this series. And so we're going to, you know, send out emails, you know, about the next one in the series. So look out for that. And also there's going to be a summary email here as well. So, you know, but we look forward to seeing you all again in the next round.
I'd like to just quickly add a great big thanks to our panelists, Jason, Andy, Carl, Rinky. The insights are invaluable. The time that you've spent, you know, this is part of giving back, right? This is the paying forward that you all talked about. And so we are very appreciative. We've had so many great questions come in, and we look forward to continuing this topic. To Karina's point, it is just so needed in the industry. And the number of questions we had raised just sort of accentuates that even further. So thank you all once again. And we look forward to the next session.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Dave.
Thanks all.
Be well. Bye-bye.